So thank you, Hansoon, and thank you, Carol, and thank you to the Language and Social Interaction Working Group for organizing this virtual lecture series. It's really great to be a part of this and to be able to join you on the last lecture of the series this year via the magic of Zoom. So I'm going to talk about the individualization of racism today, and I'll explain what I mean by this as we get into the presentation. But I want to start by taking us back a year ago to around this time. So as we know, last May 25th, George Floyd was killed by a police officer in Minneapolis. And this event sparked nationwide protests last summer and a lot of public discourse about race and racism. In fact, a lot of commentators were talking about a racial reckoning of sorts. So it's this public discourse surrounding racism that I'm interested in exploring, and we'll dive into and talk a little bit more about that today. But as we know, George Floyd's death was not the only African-American who was a victim of state-sanctioned violence last year. Just a week or so after George Floyd was killed, Rayshard Brooks was shot in the back by police officers. In the weeks before George Floyd's death, there was Daniel Prude, there was Breonna Taylor, and stretching back in the years before, there's a long list that we could add to this. Some of them include Tatiana Jefferson in 2019, Botham Jean in 2018, Stephon Clark, Philando Castile, also in Minnesota, Alton Sterling, Freddie Gray, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, and Trayvon Martin. And in many ways, this small list here, which represents a much larger list that there's no way we could put onto a single slide, represents a trend that stretches back centuries. So we could trace this back to the slave patrols of the 18th and 19th century, the terror campaigns and the lynching of the early 20th century, and even into the more subtle forms of the policing of what is often presumed to be white public spaces today, so that we even have the colloquial saying, driving while black, or walking while black, or even bird watching while black, as we saw in New York City last year. But this disproportionate violence against African Americans in the criminal justice system is not a pattern that is just based on anecdotal evidence. We know that this is a system-wide pattern due to the documentation done by social scientists, so that the probability of being black, unarmed, and shot by police is much greater than the probability of being white, unarmed, and shot by police. In fact, another study shows that if you are a young black man in the United States, you are 21 times more likely to be killed by police than if you are a young white man. So it's sort of against this backdrop that the killing of George Floyd happened last year, and the public discourse took place around racism last summer. And if you ask most Americans, and if you ask most white Americans, as Joe Fegan, a sociologist who studies race, as he says in this quote, today, most whites of all political persuasions will say that they are opposed to racism. But oftentimes the understanding of racism that they have in mind is a narrow understanding of racism that locates it in overt, visible, and individual acts, rather than sort of putting those individual acts together to understand racism as that system-wide pattern of those individual acts, in understanding racism as systemic. So the key idea that I want to get across here today is that racism is a collective system of power. It's embedded in our institutions, in our policies, in our cultural practices. But when we look at public discourse around racism, much of that public discourse individualizes racism, which in turn minimizes or erases that system-wide pattern that we just mentioned at the outset. So I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. I'm going to start off by providing a little more background on these differing meanings of racism in public discourse. I'm going to bring in some theoretical background from linguistic anthropologist Jane Hill to help us understand that. And then I will look specifically at some examples that are part of what I call, and Hansoon alluded to this earlier, the hunting for racist language game. So this discursive routine that we see often in our public discourse in the US. And then I'll bring us back at the end to the summer of 2020 and look at the discourse that took place after the killing of George Floyd, and also talk a little bit about that law and order slogan, which Donald Trump borrowed from Richard Nixon's 1968 presidential campaign, and we saw him using that during his presidential campaign last year. And then we'll open it up for discussion after that. So let's start by talking about the meaning of racism in US public discourse. And I want to start by asking you, maybe close your eyes, and what do you imagine if I'm asking you to imagine a racist? What pops into your mind? And if you're like most of us, you probably see this image pictured here in this photo, this black and white photo from times past of these KKK members wearing these white robes, these pointed hats. Or maybe you imagine somebody like a television caricature, like this Archie Bunker type figure, who is very prejudiced in his views towards people of other races. Or maybe even bringing this to recent years, you might have imagined somebody like this individual here who walked into a Charleston church in 2015, killed many of the African-American congregates because of his racial hatred towards African Americans. Or maybe even coming up to 2017, where we saw this so-called Unite the Right rally taking place in Charlottesville, Virginia. And we saw self-avowed neo-Nazis and segregationists walking through the campus of the University of Virginia, chanting slogans and advocating overtly for white supremacy. In many ways, it's easy to understand racism when we can embody racism in individual figures like this. And this very much accords with what I'm going to call definition 1 of racism, which is a definition that undergirds a lot of our public discourse in US society. So this definition defines racism in individualist terms. It defines it as antagonism and prejudice aimed at someone because of their race. We use this interchangeably with bigotry and prejudice. And this is manifested very overtly so that we could recognize that when we hear somebody uttering a racist word or a racial epithet or a slur, when we see overt and visible acts of discrimination, this all accords very well with this definition 1 of racism. But there's another definition in our public discourse, which comes from our academic discourse and academic work on the topic of race and racism. And I'm going to call this definition 2, where we're defining racism as a collective system of power. It structures our institutions, it distributes resources, that could be financial resources, educational resources, or the distribution of criminal justice. And it does that differentially according to the racial order, according to the racial hierarchy that is part of that racial order. So in this sense, racism is systemic. It runs through the social system. It's embedded in our institutions. It's manifested in our government policies, our cultural norms, and the implicit biases that arise from those cultural norms and the cultural stereotypes that go along with that. And so racism is not simply located in individuals, right? I mean, sure, there's that aspect to it, but it's much broader than just that individual definition 1. Racism is distributed across society as a collective system of power. So I want to draw a little bit from Jane Hill's work. She's a linguistic anthropologist. In her 2008 book, The Everyday Language of White Racism, she sketches out a framework for understanding racism, and she calls this the folk theory of race and racism. And a folk theory is an explanatory framework. All societies have their folk theories, their folk models that provides everyday understandings of the world. Anthropologists can go and do ethnographic research to try to understand the different tenets of some of these folk theories. And folk theories can be quite complex, but they're different from social theories or social scientific theories or scientific theories in that they are sort of self-confirming. When they're met with disconfirming evidence, they explain that away or they erase that from view. and they pull in evidence that confirms the folk theory. So there's three key pillars to the folk theory, according to Jane Hill. And the first one is this idea that race is a biological category. And then based on that first premise, it says, number two, that race and racism are therefore somehow natural and inevitable. And then the third idea is that racism is located in the individual. So it's defined as personal prejudice and bigotry. And so this very much accords with that definition one that we just introduced of racism. So to set up a positive critical stance for understanding public discourse, Jane Hill then contrasts that folk theory with what she calls the critical theory of race and racism. So this is based on scientific and social scientific work on race and racism. This is, you can think of this as the scholarly ideas associated with this topic. And so there's three key ideas here in contrast to the folk theory that I want to highlight. And the first one is that race is not a biological category, but it's a social category. As anthropologist Audrey Smedley has said, race originated as a folk idea and ideology about human differences, but it was a social invention, not a product of science. In fact, race arose after the institution of slavery was established in colonial North America, in many ways to justify that differential treatment of certain humans over others. But to say that race is a social category and not a biological category does not make it any less real. So it is still very much socially real and politically real. As the sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva says, race produces real effects on the actors racialized as Black or white. So the second key point is that race distorts the allocation of resources. I mean, this is in many ways why the pseudoscience of the 18th and 19th century was used to create this modern invention, this modern category that we know as race today, to help justify that differential distribution of resources. And then the third and final point here is that racism is collective and systemic. So again, this accords with that definition 2 of racism. So with that background, now let's shift and look at some ways that public discourse narrows in the meaning of racism to that definition 1 and sort of obscures the understanding of racism from the perspective of that definition 2. And one more idea here I want to bring in. We talked about the folk theory, which we can think of as a racial ideology, but a lot of times bolstering that folk theory are language ideologies. Language ideologies are just ideas and beliefs about language use, language users. And there's two key language ideologies that are relevant to our discussion of the discourse around racism. And these are highlighted by Jane Hill in her work. And the first one is this ideology of referentialism, which says that language is primarily about conveying information. So from this perspective, we can view words as containers of meaning. And when we relate this to racism, we could see that words are containers of racist meaning. So words themselves can be racist. And then the second language ideology is the ideology of personalism, which holds that meaning primarily resides in individual intents or beliefs. So we have to look into the mind of individuals to understand what they intended to mean. And that's where we can locate meaning. So putting these together, we could say that people who utter racist words are themselves racist. And this allows us to say in their heart of hearts, they must be racist if they're uttering those racist words. So this is how Jane Hill summarizes it. She says, if a word can be shown to be a slur that has ugly and pejorative meanings, then a person who uses it must be a racist who believes that the targets of the slur are ugly and deserving of the label and intends to communicate this fact. So just to kind of sketch this out as we put the language and racial ideologies together, we have somebody over here who might utter a racist slur, and we draw from that definition 1 that's locating racism in individuals. It very much accords with that. We can then label them a racist and sort of set up this binary where we put them on that racist side of the binary. And then the implication is that on the other side of the binary is everybody else who is not racist. And so every once in a while in public discourse, we see a lot of discussion around incidents that come along when a public figure, maybe a celebrity or a politician, makes a racist remark. And then the media firestorm ensues. And there's a lot of discussion often around the singular question of, well, are they or are they not a racist? Again, in line with that definition 1 of racism. This happened in April of 2014. There were 2 of these incidents in a single week. This caused a lot of discourse in the mainstream media. The first instance, which you may remember, involved Donald Sterling, who was an NBA owner, and he was recorded making some racist remarks in a discussion with his girlfriend, and then that got released to the media. Around that same time, there was the Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy, who you may recall was in a dispute with the federal government over grazing fees. He was giving an interview to reporters, and in that interview, he made some racial comments. And so both of these entered into the public discourse at the time, again, around that question of trying to determine in their heart of hearts, were they racist? And what does this mean for the rest of society? So just to give you a little bit of flavor of this, I'm going to play a short clip from John Oliver's show from 2014.
It turned out to be a rough week for unrepentant racists and recording devices.
The owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, Donald Sterling, was caught on audio tape telling his girlfriend not to pose for pictures with black people and not to then bring them to basketball games.
Sterling was upset after she posted an Instagram photo of her with Magic Johnson.
Wow.
Okay, so then a few minutes later in his show, then he moves on to talk about Cliven Bundy. And so here's the clip from that.
Impressively, this horrific human actually managed to somehow one-up the previous most racist person of the week, Cliven Bundy, who finished his week-long seminar on the benefits of slavery by...
All right, so it certainly gives you a flavor of the public discourse around that. And what I want to do, again, is sort of apply that theoretical framework we sketched out to understand what is going on in situations like this. So again, we have these individuals who make these racial remarks, these racist comments. We draw from that narrow definition of racism. We label them racist and then sort of separate them out as outliers from the rest of society. And this also is separating present day society from past society. So in many ways, when we label individuals as racist, we are positioning them as anachronisms, as relics of a bygone era. And the implication is that today, supposedly, we have moved beyond racism. We hear this in sort of that post-racial discourse. Past society was racist. You know, there was slavery back then. But, you know, since the civil rights movement today, we've moved beyond all of those problems. So these individuals belong in the past. And here's some of the discourse that we hear in the media. So this is an example from Bill O'Reilly's show back in 2014. He still had a show on Fox News. He referred to Donald Sterling as an incredibly lost, ignorant old guy. He also called him an old, crazy racist. Dr. Drew on CNN referred to him as an ignorant racist. We often see that collocation of ignorant racist or uneducated racist, right? This accords with that image that probably popped into a lot of our minds at the beginning of racist as uneducated individuals. So that if you're somehow educated, supposedly, you know, you've moved beyond racism and have nothing to do with that. Sean Hannity on his show says, I look at this as an anomaly. So again, sort of setting this up as an outlier to the rest of society, to present day society. And here's how Bill O'Reilly put it. There's no question that Sterling has a problem, but here is the headline. It's primarily his problem, not the country's problem. He is shameful, but does not represent anyone other than himself. So this is what I mean by the individualization of racism, right? Where we call out these individuals as racist. We sort of put them on that one side of the binary and absolve the rest of us and the rest of society as having anything to do with racism. And this individualization of racism leads to what Eduardo Bonilla Silva has called the minimization of racism. So minimizing the relevance of racism in today's society for people of color. And so the key takeaway point here is that isolating racism in individual outliers is performing ideological work in line with that folk ideology, that folk theory. And it does that by preserving the notion that racism is no longer a societal problem. It's only located in individuals. This is also part of a process that Jane Hill and Angela Reyes, who's also done work on this, called Decoding Racism, whereby decoding instances of obvious racism, speakers can stake out an ostensibly anti-racist stance. So the logic as summarized by Jane Hill might look something like this. I can say, I am a good and normal mainstream sort of white person. I am not racist because racists are bad and marginal people, or racists are uneducated people, and so on. And this is what I refer to in the papers that I've written on this as the hunting for racist language game. So this discursive routine that we just saw illustrated in a few of those previous examples. And I borrow this term hunting for racist from the sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva from this quote in his book. He says, hunting for racist is the sport of choice of those who practice the clinical approach to race relations, the careful separation of good and bad, tolerant and intolerant Americans. And I thought this was very relevant to what we see often in public discourse about racism. And this is drawing again from that narrow definition of racism that we introduced earlier, so defining that in individualist terms. So let's take a look at how this game, this discursive routine, plays out after the killing of Trayvon Martin in 2012. There was quite a bit of intense media scrutiny on the 911 tape that George Zimmerman, who you may recall is the neighborhood watch volunteer that pursued Trayvon Martin through the community where he was staying, ended up killing him that night. He made this 911 call before Trayvon Martin was killed. There was a short segment of this call, about 1.5 seconds, that was really hard to decipher. And some people thought that maybe George Zimmerman was uttering a slur during that segment. And so the media really started to focus in on this. And if we go back to that framework we sketched out earlier, looking at definition 1 of racism and the ideas of the folk theory, if you can attribute a slur to George Zimmerman, who killed Trayvon Martin, that would be an easy way to connect race to this very complicated incident, right? You don't have to go into the more complicated discussion of the various ways that race and racism factored into this that sort of fall outside all of the assumptions of the folk theory. You don't have to talk about the implicit biases based on the cultural stereotype of young Black men as criminals that George Zimmerman must have been operating with as he saw in Trayvon Martin a threat and started to follow him through the neighborhood. You don't have to get into the way the police force in Stanford, Florida, gave George Zimmerman the benefit of the doubt and let him go and took him on his word that it was all self-defense, in line with that historical pattern that we've seen where the killing of African Americans, the killers of those people are often given that pass by the criminal justice system. So again, going back to the folk theory, if we can find that he had uttered a slur, we can brand him a racist, it would be easy to connect race to that incident. So there were 3 episodes of Anderson Cooper's 360-degree show in April of 2012 that looked at this 911 tape. They isolated this segment. They went into sound booths on a couple of different times with a couple of different audio engineers. They did some enhancements. They played it over and over again. and really try to dig down and answer that question. Is George Zimmerman a racist? Did he utter a racist slur? And so here's a clip from the April 4th show that illustrates that.
Now, the 911 tape of George Zimmerman's call as he was pursuing Trayvon Martin through the gated community he was patrolling. We should warn you right now, you're going to hear some strong language. You might want to send your kids out of the room. The two words you'll hear are an expletive and some believe a racial slur. When the question first came up, 360's Gary Tuckman worked with one of our top audio experts to enhance the tape.
Rick, can we play just that second word, what we think the second word is, and hear if that sounds any different? Okay. I mean, it certainly sounds like that word to me, although you just can't be sure. But that sounds even more like the word than using it when it was with the F word before there.
That's correct.
All right, it seemed pretty clear then, but since then we've been able to use an even higher tech method to isolate what was said that night. Here again, Gary Tuckman.
This is Brian Stone. He's one of our senior audio engineers,
Correct.
An expert in this field. And you have enhanced the tape, and we're going to listen to this. I have not listened to this tape either. 2 weeks ago when we did this, I didn't listen to it because I wanted to listen to it for the first time on this equipment. The second version that's been enhanced, I haven't listened to. Let's play it.
The back entrance. Are you following them? Yeah, okay, we don't need you to do that.
Now, that certainly sounds much clearer than the first tape we listened to, right?
It's extremely clear now.
Some are accusing George Zimmerman of using the racial slur coons in his 911 call. It was preceded by the F word.
Can we play it again? Can you repeat it so we can hear it a few times? The problem is this is very short. It's only about 1.6 seconds. So
Roughly, yeah.
So once again, if we can repeat it a few times so we can hear it clearly.
Okay.
With this new, clearer audio, it's apparent the first word is a curse word. So we'll bleep it out for the rest of the story. It's the second word that's important to hear.
I don't want to say what it sounds like this time, what a lot of people are saying it sounds like, but let's play it a few times so the viewer can have an idea for themselves and make their own conclusion.
All right, so you get a sense of how this played out in the media, quite a bit of discursive work around that particular segment. Again, going back to that framework we sketched out, we have somebody here. If we can attribute a racist slur to them, it accords with that definition 1 of racism. We can label them a racist on that racist side of the binary, separating them out from the rest of society. And then, of course, the other side of playing this game, this discursive routine, would be to try to place that individual on the non-racist side of that binary. And we saw quite a bit of discursive work taking place on Fox News to place George Zimmerman on the non-racist side of the binary. And so here's a clip from Sean Hannity's show that illustrates that.
There have been implications that have been made. One was that on the 911 tape that we just played, that he might have used a racial slur. That has been countered by other people. 2 stories that I recently read, and one is that, is it true that your son would tutor African-American and minority children on the weekend? And is it also true that there was a case involving the Sanford police in which a son of a police officer hit an African-American homeless man and that he spoke out against the policeman? Is that true too, sir?
That's true concerning the assault on the homeless man. He went around to churches and put flyers on people's cars, and he just felt sorry for this homeless man not having anyone to support him.
Right.
And he...
Has he ever used any racial slur that you know of, sir?
None whatsoever.
Yeah. All right.
All right, so we can see sort of this game playing out again. Here somebody's been accused of uttering a racist slur. If so, then we can call him a racist. But if we can bring in his father, who attests that he's never done that in the past, we bring up these, what we can call small stories. So we have that story about him tutoring. the story about him helping the homeless man that sort of bolster his character as a good, outstanding citizen, right? Good, outstanding citizens have nothing to do with racism, according to the folk theory. So we can place him on that non-racist side of the binary. And then the implication that falls out from that then is that the discussants can conclude that race had nothing to do with the incident. And so the key point here, I'm asking you to sort of step back and take a meta perspective and not get caught up in determining whether or not George Zimmerman did utter a slur or not. I think that's really irrelevant for our analysis here. What we're interested in and what I want to point out is that by simply playing this language game, engaging in this discursive routine that is trying to place him on one side or the other of that binary, we are drawing from that very narrow definition of racism, and we are reinforcing and reifying the folk theory of racism, right? We're obscuring the discussion that could be taking place from a more critical perspective to really examine the way race and racism factored into incidents like that. So let's bring this now back to 2020 and the discourse taking place in the summer of last year after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. We saw quite a bit of discourse that was focused on that law and order discourse that I mentioned, and we'll get to that in a moment. But part of that discourse is also the individualizing of incidents like the killing of George Floyd. And this clip comes from Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News a few days after George Floyd was murdered. And he is interviewing Senator Ted Cruz. And I want you to listen in this clip for the way that incident is individualized.
And one of the reasons, sadly, that we are seeing this violence and this rioting is that you have a lot of demagogues that want to use this incident of clear abuse by one police officer, and they want to use it to paint every police officer as corrupt and racist. And most police officers heroically risk their lives to protect the communities they're in, often minority communities. And for everyone that is stirring up racial division and engaging in violence and looting, that is completely unacceptable. Violence and criminal conduct is unacceptable, whether it is committed by a mob in rage or whether it's committed by a police officer who's breaking the law. The law should apply fairly and uniformly to everyone. All
right, so in that clip, we see Ted Cruz. He starts off, he says, well, listen, it's horrific and it starts with a horrific act of police brutality. And then he goes on and explains, but they want to use this incident of clear abuse by one police officer, and they want to use it to paint every police officer as corrupt and racist. So there's sort of a two-part move here, right? He starts off acknowledging the horrific act of police brutality, and that is that works within the framework of the folk theory. You can acknowledge individual racist as you can recognize those very visible acts that are carried out by those individuals, but then you have to separate those acts out from the larger pattern that they might be a part of. So he has to separate the killing of George Floyd out from that larger pattern of systemic racism in policing that we saw and discussed at the outset. So as the summer progressed, we heard more of this in reaction to the Black Lives Matter protests. This is an interview on Laura Ingram's show where she interviews Donald Trump at the end of the summer last year. This is a little bit longer clip. I'm going to play the full clip and then we'll break it down after this, starting with the way he individualizes the incident of George Floyd's killing, and then we'll get into the law and order trope more specifically.
When you see the unrest on the streets, and so much of it is driven by an antipathy toward law enforcement, and more African Americans are stopped by the police, the statistics that are cited over and over again. What can you say to those families who live on those streets and who are worried? They're worried because they think their sons or even their daughters could be targeted. Because I know, because I've known you for a long time, you don't want that. You want people to all be treated equally, but they have a caricature of Republican voters, and you're the leader of the party. What do you say to them about that mischaracterization?
What the black community wants in this country is they want police and they want law and order. They don't want what's happening to their communities. They're being affected in a much harsher, meaner manner than anybody else. That includes Hispanics, where I'm doing very well also. Look, they want law and order. They want the police. You know, they do polls, and the polls are at 82, 83%. They want the police. They've gotten along with the police, and the police have been very badly mistreated because you have one bad apple, and it becomes a story for weeks.
St. Louis African-American police officer shot in the head and killed
Dorn.
last night. He's another African-American
That's true.
Just killed yesterday.
That's true. Yeah. That's true.
Killed. It's more dangerous to be a police officer today, do you not think, than it has been in
the police
a long time?
Are under siege because of things. They can do 10,000 great acts, which is what they do, and one bad apple or a choker. You know, a choker. They choke. Shooting the guy, shooting the guy in the back many times. I mean, couldn't you have done something different? Couldn't you have wrestled? You know, I mean, in the meantime, he might have been going for a weapon, and you know, there's a whole big thing there. But they choke, just like in a golf tournament. They miss a 3-foot.
You're not comparing it to golf because, of course, that's what the media.
I'm saying people choke.
People panic.
Choke.
Yeah.
And people are bad people. You have both. You have some bad people, and they choke. You could be a police officer for 15 years, and all of a sudden you're confronted. You've got a quarter of a second to make a decision. If you don't make the decision and you're wrong, you're dead. People choke under those circumstances, and they make a bad decision. I've seen bad decisions of people that it looked bad, but probably it was a choke. But you also have bad police, but you also, not only the vast majority, thousands and thousands of great acts and one bad one, and you make the evening news for a week.
All right, so there's a lot going on there, but let's start by talking about the way he's individualizing the incident of the killing of George Floyd and others that took place last summer. So he starts off, he says, look, they, the Black community, want law and order. They want the police. They've gotten along with the police, and the police have been very badly mistreated because you got one bad apple and it becomes a story for weeks. And again, we could see the bad apple metaphor. It's a metaphor that is commonly invoked to individualize incidents and events. And we can see him invoking that here to position. It's interesting because he's talking about somebody choking and shooting somebody in the back multiple times. I think what he has in mind there was the killing of Rayshard Brooks after, a week or so after George Floyd was killed. But the specific officer always remains unsaid. There's no specific reference for that here within this dialogue. And I think that really underscores that the one bad apple that he's referring to could refer to any one of the number that sort of fit that larger pattern that happened last summer and the wider pattern that we discussed at the outset. So it almost undermines his claim. But we could see how that is used to individualize incidents like the killing of George Floyd or Rayshard Brooks. And then by implication, the rest of the system is not racist. There is no systemic racism in policing, according to this view. And so what is happening here is the erasure of that system-wide pattern, the erasure of that systemic racism. And Judith Irvine and Sue Gall define erasure, which is an ideological process. They say erasure is the process in which ideology renders some persons or activities invisible. Facts that are inconsistent with the ideological scheme either go unnoticed or get explained away. So we could see how the facts that are inconsistent with the folk ideology get explained away or are rendered invisible through the metaphor of the one bad apple and so on. And so it's really obscuring this larger pattern and ignoring and erasing this larger pattern from the discourse. So let's say a few things to finish up here about that law and order trope. This was a slogan that, as you know, was used by Richard Nixon in 1968. This is an image of him speaking at the Republican National Convention that year during his acceptance speech. The slogan also appeared in a lot of his campaign ads and materials. And then, as we know, last summer, Donald Trump recycled this trope. I think for many of us, what seemed to be a very transparent recycling of this trope, along with some of the coded racial appeals that it carries during his presidential campaign in 2020. And I want to give credit and recognition to my student, Gianna Ciponeri. Gianna and I have been working on exploring the discourse from last summer, especially as it relates to the use of this law and order slogan. We started working on this project earlier in the semester. And so a lot of these ideas, I want to give her credit for them as well. And we should have a working paper available next month. If you're interested in reading that, let me know and I can make sure you get a copy. And so, we got interested in this because as we saw, calls for law and order ostensibly sound as if they fall within the general moral order, somewhat similar to the idea that Black Lives Matter. I mean, how do you say, oh, I'm against law and order? You're not going to say you're against Black Lives Matter or you're against law and order necessarily. So it's an easy way for discussants like Trump and others to effectively oppose the Black Lives Matter movement without simply saying Black lives do not matter. And then as we say, but beneath the vagueness of this simple slogan resides the pernicious logic of the dominant racial ideology. And so we can see how this is drawing from the folk theory. And we saw that in the previous clips, how it's individualizing acts like the killing of George Floyd. And then it's also drawing from this trope of the law and order idea. And so this is how we sketched out our explanation for how the law and order slogan is carrying with it some of those coded racial appeals. When law and order is invoked in the discourse that we were looking at, it's often referring to social order. But social order is a polysemous term, so it has dual meanings. And so in the first sense of social order is understood as orderliness in contrast to chaos and unrest. So a lot of the discourse that we saw on Fox News last summer, really emphasized the protest, brought in images. We saw some of those images in the clips we just looked at, really highlighting up the images of the protests that emphasize some violent acts during the protests, labeling the protest as a movement in terms of these descriptors, chaos and unrest. And we often see these descriptors in the shows. We can see the headline here behind Tucker Carlson referring to chaos in Minneapolis. So this sense of social order really is painting the racial justice protest that took place last summer in terms of being disorderly. And so calling for social order to sort of counter that disorder in the streets. But then there's a slippage between that first sense of social order and the second sense of social order, which is social order as the social system, as society, right? As the structures, the institutions, the practices that make up our society, that make up the racial order in that society, that include the racial hierarchy that contributes to the status quo where criminal justice is disproportionately provided to people according to that hierarchy. So the discussants can refer to law and order, which sounds like they're calling simply for orderliness, but at the same time, they're sort of also defending the racial status quo. And so just to kind of summarize those ideas, the coded racial appeal of the law and order trope arises from the slippage between the first sense of social order and the second sense. And discussants can use the law and order trope to ostensibly talk about countering social unrest while also implicitly defending the current racial order. And so the outcomes of this discourse, the law and order discourse, but also a lot of the discourse around race and racism that draws from the folk theory, it leads to this individualization of racism that we've seen in many of these examples. And that individualization of racism leads to the ignoring of the pattern of systemic racism. We talked about this early in terms of minimizing it. I think really we can go farther and say it actually ignores it. There's a willful ignorance here. Charles Mill, the philosopher, talks about this idea of white ignorance. And that's what I have in mind here when using that term ignoring. There's the ignoring of that wider pattern. And then if you can ignore that wider pattern that the racial justice protesters are trying to call out during the summer protests last year, then you effectively remove the motive for them to be out in the streets protesting. And then that leads to being able to lump them together with criminal elements, as we saw back in Nixon's discourse in 1968. We also saw this recycled last year. So it leads to this criminalizing of the protesters and the racial justice advocates more broadly. And then it ends up inverting the racial vulnerability, so that rather than recognizing that it's the African Americans who are the victims of state-sanctioned violence in that widespread pattern that stretches back in history all the way to the present, now the discourse inverts that vulnerability so that the police are under siege, as we saw in that excerpt from Donald Trump, where he said the police are under siege. So with that said, let me end there. And I want to, here's some of the works that I cited throughout the talk today, but I want to open it up for discussion. And if you have questions, that's great, but I'm also would love to hear any comments or thoughts you have, reactions you have. Maybe also if you have other ideas that you want to talk about in terms of the examples that I show and highlight some aspects of the discourse data that we examined here today that I didn't have a chance to talk about, feel free to open that, I'm open to hearing that as well. So I guess with that said, Carol, I will turn it over to you and see if there's any questions that came out.
I actually have the first question for you. Someone was wondering if you are familiar with Witherell and Potter's Mapping the Language of Racism, and if you have any thoughts on that in regards to developing an argument about their argument about the individualization of racism in similar ways.
I don't, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with that work, so I would need a little more background on that. If that person would care to maybe say a little bit more about what they have in mind and how we could apply that.
They were actually not able to attend this. They had emailed the question in hopes of watching the recording. So sorry about that. Carol?
Yes, thank you. So here we have another question. Thank you so much for this important talk. It's fascinating. How much of the law and order talk is focused on property? Can you talk about the relationship between the riot, mob, and looting tropes are related to law and order and related to historical understandings about race?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I'd be curious to hear some more thoughts that you have about how that's related to property, because I think there's certainly evidence in the discourse that would support that idea. A lot of times when somebody like Tucker Carlson is talking about and calling for law and order, they're objecting very explicitly to what they see as the destruction of property. And so, I think that just sort of is part of the discourse in that it is also used as another way to justify the calls for orderliness in contrast to disorder. But then I think it also, drawing from property law, it allows them to make that step to criminalizing protesters who are attending street protests where property might be damaged, right? So you can sort of paint them all as criminals if they're out there in the streets where property is damaged. I don't know if that helps to get to what maybe you had in mind, but.
Great, thank you. The next question, has any research been done to examine common responses to speakers like Cruz or Trump who individualize the acts? Like, is there a common set of response types to the individualization?
Well, I think, unfortunately in our mainstream discourse, a lot of times in the mainstream media discourse, the assumptions that they carry, that narrow definition, that what we call definition one, which sort of undergirds the ideas that they're sharing when they talk, that assumption about what racism means often goes unchallenged. And I think that's part of the problem. I think we need to see more, and it's not to say it never goes unchallenged, but I think, too often it goes unchallenged, which allows for the reinforcement of the narrow definition of racism. And so I think to effectively counter that, we need to see discussants challenging each other to define what we mean by that term. So, Senator Cruz, what do you mean when you say racism? What's your definition of racism? Here's how I understand racism. If we look at this from a historical perspective, we could see that there's this pattern. And so I want to recognize that there's this collective pattern, so something like that, I think, would do more to maybe try to move the discourse beyond where it's currently at.
Thank you. So here's another question. Thanks very much for this important work. As many racist incidents are individually experienced, I wonder about your thoughts on the kind of work that individuals need to undertake to first arrive at insights on a structural or institutional level from these individual instances, and then come up with action plans at the individual/local community level.
Yeah, boy, I love these questions about how to actually do something about this, right? And unfortunately, as a linguist, I'm sort of more focused on analyzing the language and probably don't have the best ideas for that. I think everybody out there probably has some good ideas, but I think it starts by trying to connect the dots, right? So as you said, there's these individual incidents where people experience racism individually. And if we could view those not just in isolation from each other, which I think as we illustrated here in this talk is the problem, but if we could broaden the discourse to understand the way those individual incidents are connected and the way those are related to historical patterns, the way that they relate to policies that we might not always overtly recognize as being racist, but they have a racial bias that is the result of policies like that. If we can connect those dots, then I think that's an important first step to really bringing attention to the more systemic dimension of racism.
The next question is in a similar vein. So you might have already covered most of it, but in case you have any additional thoughts, thank you for this amazing talk. Have you looked at instances of speakers resisting the individualization of racism in public discourse? And if so, have you noticed any interactional practices that seem to more or less effectively shift the conversation from individual to systemic issues of racism?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's definitely incidents of that. When Hansoon mentioned at the beginning, a couple of my papers where I talk about this, in one of those papers, I was looking at different cable media news shows. So I was looking at not just Fox News and CNN, but looking at MSNBC. And although we see sort of the individualization as sort of a mainstream phenomenon that does not, goes beyond just the normal political proclivities, right? So it doesn't really matter if you're liberal or conservative, you're still drawing from that popular discourse in many ways. But as you might expect, Fox News has a very different perspective on affairs than MSNBC. In the data that I was looking at for some of those previous papers, I saw more instances on MSNBC where discussants would challenge the assumptions of racism embedded in the folk theory. And they would try to insert a more critical perspective into the discussion, and were successful at doing that. And one common denominator that I found was that a lot of those discussants were not the news show hosts necessarily, but they were guests, and they were professors who would be able to insert the academic perspective into the conversation, the same perspective that we were discussing here today, and were effective at being able to challenge the assumptions of the folk theory in that way. Another example was the New York Times columnist Charles Blow. He does a really good job. I don't know if you read his column in the New York Times. He does a great job of really challenging a lot of the assumptions about racism. And in some of the examples where he was a guest on a show on MSNBC and that corpus that I looked at, he did a very effective job as well at challenging that. So it does happen. And I think we need to look to those examples as, maybe models for how to better challenge the discourse.
All right. So our next question. Thank you for a great talk. Are you considering looking at the discourse around the attack on the Capitol at all in relation to the presence or absence of the law and order trope?
That would be interesting. Yeah. We haven't looked at that, but I think that's a good idea. As we continue to develop this law and order project, we should definitely look into that. And if you do any work on that, I would love to hear about it.
The next question, you touched a little on racial ideologies, Hill 2009 and Reyes 2011. And I wonder if you draw any connections between linguistic ideologies like ratio-linguistics by Flores and Rosa and systemic racism in regards to police violence in minority communities.
Oh, sure. I mean, Jonathan Rosa has done a lot of work on this. I know he's been doing work with Adrian Lowe as well to really highlight some of the ideas that I also talked about here today. So I think, it's very much in line with his program of ratio linguistics.
So here's a follow-up question from someone who asked a question about poverty, right? Making a connection between poverty and law and order. A follow-up, I've been tracing connections between mainstream conversations, in particular during the Republican National Convention in rural white discourse around race and around the Black Lives Matter protests. Interestingly, two areas of connection seem to be a need to protect property and also to protect Second Amendment rights. The ways that both of these narratives are actually related to race goes unsaid.
What was that last part?
Goes unsaid.
Goes unsaid. Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's part of the implicit appeals of sort of that law and order trope, where you could call for law and order and overtly position yourself as being for the Second Amendment, like you say, for protecting property rights. But you don't have to overtly come out and say, and by the way, when I say protecting property rights, this has a long legacy of going back to protecting the rights of slave owners, where Black bodies were the property of plantation owners, and so on, right? And looking at all of the ways that race really factors into what it is you're actually saying. So it's a way to overtly call for something that ostensibly has potentially a widespread appeal without having to really, but still, making those coded racial appeals, but without having to address, say, the Black Lives Movement on the face value of what they're trying to argue for.
The next one, thank you for these insights. Do you have any thoughts on the even more prevalent individualization-based messages we have seen in reaction to the verdict of Officer Chauvin on both sides of the binary?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We should go back and look at the discourse after the trial verdict came out and the whole discourse around the trial. That's something we haven't looked at yet. I think that would be interesting to add as well, because in many ways, like we said, the killing of George Floyd, is easy to position that as an anomaly. And I think we saw that happening maybe even more and more. I don't know, that's just a guess. I'd have to look more specifically at the discourse, but probably saw that more even during the trial because it was such an egregious incident of police brutality. So even in the examples that we looked at, we had Senator Cruz acknowledging that it was a horrific act. And some of the discourse examples from Laura Ingram's show last summer, she would, overtly acknowledge the horrific act that it was. And they could do that. So, there's a widespread agreement that it was horrific. Derek Chauvin should be punished, that it was murder, as the jurors decided. Everybody across the political spectrum could agree on that. But then if you're also saying that it's an anomaly and it's not representative of a larger pattern of state-sanctioned violence against African Americans, then you're sort of missing the bigger picture, I think, of what that the killing of George Floyd represented.
Thank you. The next question, thank you for this talk. I'm wondering about the differences between institutional talk, where roles and power dynamics are arguably clearer, and everyday talk. I think the idea of individualizing racism is seen in both. Have you thought about whether we can say these interactional practices is doing the same thing in both contexts?
I think you probably could. And another thing I wanted to look at, and I haven't had a chance to yet, is the institutional response to the killing of George Floyd last summer. I think we saw universities across the United States, we saw companies across the United States all issuing statements about racism. And I would love to go and look more closely at those statements and try to understand to what extent are they acknowledging the systemic aspects of racism versus simply acknowledging sort of the individualized aspects of racism in those statements. In many ways, it's easier to acknowledge it from an individual perspective without having to then dive into and do the difficult work as an institution, as a university, on examining your hiring practices, for example, your tenure and promotion policies, and how race might be embedded in those, and you're bringing students to campus and deciding who gets to be a student. All of these things we need to be looking at. So anyway, yeah, I think it would be helpful to, it's a good project if somebody wants to dive into that.
The next one is more just a comment someone was offering, if you wanted to respond to it. The idea of police under siege reminds me of that of young men under siege because of the Me Too movement, especially after the Kavanaugh case.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I often see in this reactionary discourse that we hear a lot from conservative figures, there's sort of this underlying premise of persecution. And, that's something I've noticed going all the way back to the George W. Bush administration, and I think Dick Cheney did this quite a bit, sort of positioning himself as being persecuted for his beliefs. And I think we've seen more and more of that discourse, in the conservative media since then. I think certainly Donald Trump embodied that quite a bit.
Okay, so this is the last question in the Q&A box. So I just want to encourage everyone, we still have some time. So if you would like to ask Adam questions, please type your questions in the Q&A box. Have you looked at connections between the kind of media discourse you described so clearly here and everyday conversations about race? So this question is kind of related to a question that has been asked previously, and or more local media outlets? Or do you know of anyone doing that kind of work?
Yeah, Toon Van Dyke's early study, I think it was in the 1990s, of talk about racism and just everyday conversations comes to mind in terms of that. Certainly in Jane Hill's work on the everyday language of white racism, she starts to get into some of those more everyday conversations. So those are a couple that come to mind, and I'm sure there's more out there. There should be more out there. And that would be an interesting focus to look at.
I have a question for you. I was wondering, in looking at the discourse, if you noticed any of the same systemic individualization happening on the other side, where like when people were talking about the rioters and the looters, if that conversation also, if you saw any parallels there, because I saw a lot of people drawing those parallels and they were talking about it on like social media, and it was like, well, this is the same thing. You can't blame one person for the whole. Just so curious.
That's interesting. Yeah. There's maybe sort of a microcosm of that at play. I guess I'm hesitant to. I'd be concerned about drawing a false equivalency between that, because I think there's a fundamental difference there. So I think it is important to look at the bigger picture rather than just applying that to the other side. I think we still need to critically look at the bigger picture in terms of, I mean, I know that news outlets have done analyses on the violence during the protests last summer and found a very small fraction of them being violent, which I think is important. And so anyway, yeah, something to think about.
So here's another question. How do colleagues in academia respond to your work? Do you find resistance or understanding?
Good question. Well, I guess I mostly share the work with other linguistic anthropologists and discourse analysts who I think are pretty receptive to it, and who share, sort of that critical view of trying to understand society and trying to, when I say critical, I mean that sort of in the generic sense of really trying to understand the dynamics of power that are at play in the use of language, in some of the instances of discourse that we looked at and others. And I think most scholars who study language and society are interested in sort of, unraveling some of those power dynamics.
Right. So as we are winding down, I just want to remind everybody to subscribe to the LANSI listserv and also follow us on Twitter. Maybe we'll give everyone around 10 seconds if they have questions to ask. So everybody, if you haven't subscribed to the LANSI listserv, you can look at chat, and I also included the LANSI Twitter handle there. So it looks like we are almost, I think we're done with questions, and we have had a lot of questions, and thank you so much, Adam, for both your talk and for answering all the questions. And you are the last speaker of the LANSI virtual lecture series. We are so honored to have you talking to us about this very important topic. So that's all for today, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thanks again, Adam, for your talk.
Well, thank you to all the organizers, and thank you to everybody who attended today.